But I talk about political correctness, and a lot of people think, and realize there's something that is very, very wrong, but can't quite put our finger on it, on where is all this coming from. And the ideology behind political correctness is commonly known as cultural Marxism. You could describe it academically as neo-Marxism and postmodernism. And this is what I want to talk about mainly tonight, and what's behind it. But you can go back in history to various points and try to find out and identify where is all this attack on freedom of speech coming from. Is it coming from the 1960s, the 60s Western Cultural Revolution, which was just as profound as Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, but didn't really seem like it because there was not really any violence in the 60s, not in the West anyway, not much. Could you go back to the 1920s, the 1910s, the Bolshevik Revolution? Or could you go back further? I'll start with Karl Marx. You could even go back further in time to the French Revolution and so on, where similar things happened. But let's start by considering Karl Marx and Marxism, which obviously is where cultural Marxism gets its name. Now, the two most well-known pieces of work written by Karl Marx was the Communist Manifesto of 1848 and Das Kapital, Capital, of 1867. I read the Communist Manifesto. It only takes about an hour, actually. I've never read it until like a year ago. I'm still reading Capital. I haven't got too far. But the Communist Manifesto speaks of a society in conflict and suggests that capitalist societies are inherently oppressive because the bourgeoisie own all of the capital. They own all of the property and the means of production, the businesses. And the bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat. And so society is inherently oppressive. But to overcome this inherent injustice in society, the proletariat need to rise up in revolution, overthrow the bourgeoisie, take control of the capital, collectivize it, and then we will live in a wonderful utopia. And of course, it hasn't worked. It doesn't work. It's been tried. It's been tried in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and it didn't lead to a wonderful workers' utopia of equality and social justice. It led to hell. It led to murder and tyranny and the gulags. We know with Hitler's National Socialists, in the 40s, we had 6 million Jews were sent to concentration camps. But what's not spoken about so much is the Holodomor in 1932, with 6 million at least, 6 million Ukrainians died in the liquidation of the kulaks when Stalin collectivized all of the productive farms. And so all of the good farmers who knew how to farm were sent off to the gulags. They were collectivized. The people that they were put in charge didn't know how to farm properly. Food production went down. The food that was produced was taken off to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the Ukrainians died because they didn't have any food. I'll take questions in the end. So that's just one of the horrors of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's 6 million at least. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, estimates 60 million died between 1917 and 1959. I think with Lenin and Stalin. Khrushchev killed a few more. We've seen how Marx's ideas have been tried in China. And again, you get the same hell. His so-called Great Leap Forward was a leap into the grave for another 60 million at least. Pol Pot tried it in China, and now you see it in Venezuela. being tried out, Marx's ideas, and it's not leading to a wonderful world of prosperity. It's leading to a horror of hunger, and you see thousands, tens of thousands of Venezuelans are desperate to cross the border into Colombia or Brazil. They're fleeing their country because there's no goods in the shops. This is what happens when Marx's ideas are put into practice. And the tragedy of today is that people still believe in them. People say that this wasn't real Marxism, it wasn't done properly. But how many times do we have to try this before we realize that doesn't lead to a workers' utopia? It always leads to hell. How many times do we try that? Marx and Engels as well suggested that in the utopian workers' paradise, three things would have to be abolished, which were private property, of course everything would be collectivized, the family, and the nation state. And that's also a terrible thing. If the state owns everything, you have no power over anything. You don't own anything. The state can tell you where you live, what you drive, where you work, where you go on holiday, what you eat. The state basically owns you and all the property. So if the state decides that you've been a naughty boy or a naughty girl, it can say, well, okay, I'm going to move you to this house over there. You don't own the place you live. You never have the chance of owning your own place because it's owned by the state. It controls everything about you. The family needed to go. And it suggested that, Marx and Engels suggested that children should be brought up by a collective of the women rather than their own parents. And that's to cut the connection between you and previous generations. You see, values, principles, beliefs, culture is passed down from generation to generation. Your family gives you a sense of belonging and connection to the past. I don't think there's anyone here who would say that family, is a bad thing per se. Maybe some of us have had, bad experiences of family, and most of us hopefully have had good experiences of our family. It doesn't always work out. But as a rule, it's a very good thing. And it passes the culture down through the generations. And it also gives you a connection to your future. When you have sons and daughters of your own, you'll pass on, you'll teach them what you've learned from your parents and your grandparents. You pass your culture on to your descendants. You have a connection to the past and the future. And that goes along with the nation state. It gives you, again, a sense of belonging to a smaller group of people. I mean, naturally, we live in tribes. I mean, in the long distant past, we lived in tribes. And so when we live in tribes, you have a connection with a small group of people. In the nation, okay, we don't live in tribes anymore, but we have a connection to a smaller group of people in amongst the global whole. It's a good thing. And that leads to true diversity. Different nation states, we have our own English culture or British culture. Koreans have their culture, Ugandans have their culture, the Zulus have a culture, and the Arapesh Indians have a culture, the Argentines have a culture. It's good. There's a true diversity of different cultures that we get from our nations, from having different nations. Marxism wants to completely abolish that. It just sees people as individual economic units with who shouldn't have any connection to a family or nation. Would just sweep everything away. And so there's no sense of identity or belonging left. That's the workers' utopia. Doesn't sound like utopia to me.